The crystal chandeliers of the Whitmore Villa cast a $1,000,000 glow over the ballroom, but the ice in my wife's eyes was colder than the vintage champagne. Lauren didn't pull me aside, she cornered me right in front of the marble fountain I'd commissioned in secret. Her voice was a sharp, polished blade. "My mom doesn't want you here, Daniel," she hissed, adjusting her diamond necklace, a gift I'd sent anonymously. "You're a shadow in a room full of suns. Do us both a favor and vanish before the real guests notice you." She had no idea she was trying to evict the man who signed the master deed for the very ground she was standing on. I stood there in my off-the-rack suit, a deliberate ghost at my own feast. I'd spent 3 years playing this struggling freelancer, just to see if Lauren loved the man or the empire. As I watched her glide away toward her mother, Margaret, who was currently holding court like a displaced queen, the toxic rhythm of the evening settled in. Margaret beckoned me over not to greet me, but to hand me her empty glass without looking up. To them I was a social anchor dragging down their ascent. I took the glass, feeling the weight of the character clause in my pocket. The test was almost over, and the villa doors were about to open for the city's elite, and my true identity. The weight of the empty crystal flute in my hand was nothing compared to the weight of the secret I had carried for 3 years. To Lauren and Margaret, I was a man of missed opportunities, a freelancer whose greatest contribution to the household was keeping the coffee pot full while they dreamed of marble hallways. They saw a man who had stalled, they never saw the man who was building the track beneath their feet. Every morning I would kiss Lauren goodbye and head to a co-working space that was actually a secure, top-floor suite overlooking the city's financial district. There the unemployed husband vanished. In his place stood the CEO of Meridian Holdings, orchestrating the very acquisitions that had quietly funneled millions into the Whitmore family's luck. I had spent 36 months balancing on this razor's edge, pouring my resources into Margaret's lifelong dream of a villa, not out of duty, but as a final desperate test of their hearts. I wanted to know if, once they climbed the mountain I built for them, they would still reach back to hold my hand, or if they would use their new height to look down on me. Seeing the world through their eyes tonight, I realized that some people don't want a partner, they want a pedestal. If you find yourself rooting for the man in the shadows, perhaps you'll want to stay for the moment the lights finally come up. Hitting that like button is how we know you're standing with us in the dark. The evening air was thick with the scent of lilies and expensive perfume, but the atmosphere turned frigid the moment I stepped onto the plush crimson runner. Lauren was already at the center of a swarm of photographers, her silk gown catching the flashbulbs like liquid moonlight. When our eyes met, I saw no warmth, only a flicker of irritation that I had dared to show up. She didn't move toward me. Instead, she stepped closer to Julian Vane, a man whose family name was synonymous with old money and older arrogance. Julian placed a possessive hand on her waist, and the cameras went into a frenzy. I stood 10 feet away, a smudge on their perfect picture. Lauren laughed at something Julian whispered, her eyes never straying back to the man who had actually paid for the carpet beneath her heels. I watched as she posed, tilting her head with a practiced grace, a stranger wearing the face of my wife. She was playing a role in a high society drama, and in her mind, I was nothing more than a background extra who had overstayed his scene. The cameras didn't blink for me and Lauren didn't either. Margaret Whitmore stood at the top of the grand staircase, surveying the ballroom like a general who had finally conquered the territory she felt she deserved. When I approached her to offer my congratulations, she didn't even acknowledge the gesture. Instead, her eyes fell on the small wrapped box in my hand, a rare hand-carved clock from the 18th century I had tracked down through an estate in London. It was a masterpiece of horology, a gift meant to symbolize the time we had invested in this family. "Oh, Daniel," Margaret sighed, her voice carrying enough volume for the nearby socialites to hear. "How quaint. You really shouldn't have spent your little savings on something so small. We have the Grand Hall clock arriving tomorrow. It's a Vane family heirloom, a real piece of history." She handed my gift to a passing server without opening it, as if it were a used napkin. She had no idea that the Vane heirloom she was waiting for was actually a replica, or that the villa she now called her kingdom was legally a hollow shell until my signature hit the final deed. Julian Vane moved through the crowd with the effortless entitlement of a man who had never been told no. He regaled a group of investors with stories of his recent yachting trip in the Mediterranean, flaunting a lifestyle of leisure that Lauren devoured with hungry eyes. "It's about vision," Julian proclaimed, his voice booming. "Knowing which assets to squeeze and which to discard." He glanced at me with a smirk that told me I was firmly in the discard category. What Julian didn't mention was that his family's firm had been hemorrhaging capital for 18 months, and the Mediterranean yacht was currently being leased by one of my subsidiary companies. I provided the oxygen Julian breathed, yet here he was, selling my wife a dream built on my own reality. Lauren looked at him as if he were a savior, her admiration a bitter pill to swallow. She was falling in love with a mask, oblivious to the fact that the man behind the curtain was the husband she was currently trying to hide in the coat room. The library smelled of old paper and new money, a quiet sanctuary Lauren had chosen for my execution. She stood by the mahogany desk, her silhouette sharp against the moonlight. "This has to end, Daniel," she began, her voice devoid of the softness that used to greet me at the end of the day. "Mom's grand opening is a turning point for us. For her. Julian is offering us a seat at the table we've been trying to reach for years." She stepped closer, her perfume cloying in the small space. "You're a good man, but you aren't a Whitmore man. You don't belong in this world, and frankly, you're embarrassing her." She demanded I leave not just the party but the house to avoid staining the prestige of the evening. It is a haunting thing to realize the person you promised to protect sees you as a threat to their vanity. It makes you wonder how many of us are being discarded by those we helped build up. If this betrayal strikes a chord, sharing this story might be the only way to remind others that the quietest person in the room is often the one holding it together. The ballroom fell into a hushed silence as Margaret took the microphone, her face radiant with a triumphant, predatory glow. "Tonight is about legacy," she announced, "and about making the difficult choices that preserve it." She looked directly at Lauren, beckoning her forward. "My daughter has finally realized that to soar, one must cut away the weight that holds them down." To my horror, Lauren stepped forward, clutching a thick manila envelope. In front of the city's wealthiest families, she handed me the papers. "These are divorce filings, Daniel. And a check. It's more than you've made in the last 3 years combined. Think of it as a thank you for your patience." The crowd whispered, some snickering, others looking away in pity. Julian Vane stepped up beside her, sliding an arm around her waist as Margaret announced their intended union. I stood in the center of the circle, the envelope in my hand, feeling the final tether of my marriage snap under the weight of their combined greed. "Security, please see this gentleman to the gates," Margaret commanded, her voice ringing with a cruel finality. 2 large men in suits stepped toward me, their hands reaching for my shoulders. The guests watched, phones raised to capture the fall of the unemployed husband. But before they could touch me, the heavy oak doors of the villa were thrown open with a force that rattled the chandeliers. The room froze. It wasn't the police but a phalanx of men in charcoal-gray tailored suits. At the front was the city mayor and the master developer of the entire royal district, the man whose name was etched into the cornerstone of every luxury building in the zip code. Margaret's face broke into a desperate, fawning smile. "Mayor, we weren't expecting you until the late toast." She rushed forward, Julian and Lauren trailing behind her like eager puppies. They reached out to shake the mayor's hand, but he didn't even see them. He walked past them as if they were furniture, his eyes locked on me. The master developer stopped exactly 3 feet in front of me and dropped into a respectful bow. The mayor followed suit, his voice echoing in the stunned silence of the ballroom. "Forgive the delay, Mr. Carter. The paperwork for the final acquisition took longer than anticipated." He turned to the crowd, his voice projecting with authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor to introduce the true visionary behind the Royal Heights development, and the sole owner of this estate, Daniel Carter, CEO of Meridian Holdings." The golden key, resting on a velvet cushion, was held out to me. Margaret's hand, still extended for a handshake that never came, began to shake. Lauren's face went a ghostly shade of white, her eyes darting from the mayor to the man she had just served with divorce papers. Julian Vane took a step back, his bravado vanishing as he realized he was standing in the house of the man who held his family's debt. I took the key, the cold metal a heavy reminder that the test was finally over. "Daniel?" Lauren's voice was a fragile whisper, a desperate attempt to reclaim a husband she had just discarded. "What is this? Why didn't you tell me?" I looked at her, and for the first time, I felt nothing but a profound, quiet exhaustion. "I wanted to see who you were when you thought you didn't need me, Lauren. I wanted to see if Margaret's dream was about a home, or about power." I turned to Margaret, whose mouth was working but no sound was coming out. "The Whitmore Villa was a gift held in a character contingent trust," I explained to the room. "The deed was to be transferred tonight. But the clause was simple. The gift is voided if the beneficiaries demonstrate gross moral turpitude or attempt to evict the grantor." I held up the envelope Lauren had given me. "You didn't just serve me papers, Lauren. You triggered the exit clause. This villa doesn't belong to you. It never did. And neither do I." In this final moment of reflection, we see that wealth can build a house, but it can never build a home. If you've found value in this journey of truth and consequence, consider joining our community by subscribing so you never miss the moment karma finds its mark. I didn't wait for their tears or their apologies. I knew they were coming. The frantic explanations, it was all a misunderstanding, the desperate attempts to claw back the life they had just thrown away. I turned my back on the chandeliers and the fountain, walking toward the grand doors. "Mr. Bennett," I said to my head of security, "see that the guests are escorted out safely." And then shut it down. As I reached my car, I checked my phone. One tap was all it took. Behind me, the Whitmore Villa, the palace that was supposed to launch a new dynasty, suddenly went dark. The exterior floodlights, the fountain, and the massive chandeliers all died at once, plunging the estate into a blackness so thick it seemed to swallow the hill. The utility company, another branch of the Meridian Tree, had cut the line. I drove away into the night, the silhouette of the darkened house fading in my rearview mirror. I had built a kingdom for a queen, but found only a shadow. Karma hadn't just struck, it had cleared the stage.